This year, the series is entirely devoted to the topic of Jewish creative resilience in times of conflict and reinvention. In the past few years, the Jewish world has experienced more conflict than we ever thought to see in our lifetimes. It has been incredibly hard. But it is helpful to remember that Jews have been through hard times before, and to turn to that history in order to learn about the strategies that previous generations have come up with, and perhaps find hope and inspiration from what we learn. This series is designed to enter that uncomfortable space we are all inhabiting and use that discomfort as a productive opportunity to imagine new possibilities and perhaps different futures. We offer this series respectfully and hope you will respond in kind, joining us in the confidence that the earliest rabbis committed to in the Talmud, that vigorous debate is a creative source of resiliency and survival. It is in that spirit that I welcome you to tonight's lecture, Table Fellowship as a Holy Altar, How Dinner Parties Shape Rabbinic Judaism, by Krista Dalton. Dr. Krista Dalton is Associate Professor of Religious and Jewish Studies at Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio. Describing herself as a cultural historian of religion, she works primarily with the texts and traditions of ancient Judaism within the Mediterranean context. Her first book, entitled How Rabbis Became Experts, out with Princeton University Press this year, analyzes the process by which the rabbis of late ancient Roman Palestine became seen as religious experts in Jewish communities. Her second and current project, entitled The Rabbi, A Cultural History, also to appear through Princeton University Press, offers a broad survey of the vocation of rabbis from antiquity to modernity. Dr. Dalton is also co-editing the Oxford Handbook of Rabbinic Literature, and because you have to keep it interesting, apparently, when not writing about rabbis, she is exploring the intersections of science fiction, fan communities, and the Bible. Dr. Dalton is also an editor-in-chief of Ancient Jew Review and on the board of directors of the Association for Jewish Studies. Please join me in welcoming Krista Dalton.
Thank you. I do teach a class, Religion for Robots. So I'm at a liberal arts college, and I'm the Jewish Studies professor, so I like to tell people I teach about Jews in the past, in the present, and then in outer space. So this is what I do, which I have good readings for it. If you want recommendations after this, I've got great things for you. So thank you, Natan, for the invitation to be here. Thank you to Marielle for all your help with the coordination. I'm so pleased to share the next hour together. I've talked to many of you. This is a great group, right? We're small but mighty. I like you already. And we're going to spend some time thinking about how the earliest rabbis used dinner parties, of all things, to shape Rabbinic Judaism. And you might be asking, why dinner parties? Well, you have to hear it again. I published a book. I'm really proud. Writing a book in a pandemic is not easy, right? So everyone who published a book this year, we should get extra awards, extra applause, yes. I published a book entitled How Rabbis Became Experts, Social Circles and Donor Networks in Jewish Late Antiquity. In it, I show that rabbis did not become authoritative experts in Jewish communities automatically. There's no office of rabbi in the Torah. Priests, judges, to be sure, but no rabbis. So when they emerged on the scene in Galilee over 2,000 years ago, they only had their networks, charisma, and love of Torah to work with because they had no institutional backing. They were just men who cared, but Jews did not have to listen to them, and they didn't. I show how rabbis had to work to persuade other Jews that their interpretations of Torah were worthwhile. And this meant getting out of their exclusive circles and into the streets. It meant interacting in the market, giving advice to friends and neighbors, attending social functions, and yes, dinner parties. So today, I want to begin by introducing who the earliest rabbis are, making sure we're all on the same page, and how they emerged under the immense constraints of Roman imperialism. I'll examine how rabbis harnessed the cultural power of dinner parties in the Roman world as a site of resistance to empire. They reframed meals with Jewish rituals, directed blessings away from Roman gods, and used dining as a kind of portable altar that could replace the destroyed Jerusalem temple. Then I will explore how dinner parties elevated rabbis as Jewish experts by providing opportunities to connect with influential Jewish neighbors. Dinner became a vital way for rabbis to nurture recognition for their expertise, to gain important donors and friends, and spread their ideas about Jewish piety. So we'll see how dinner was the primary site for the cultivation and I would argue the survival of Rabbinic Judaism. So let's begin. The men we call the rabbis refer to a cohort of Torah scholars in the 2nd century CE who formed study circles in Roman Galilee following the destruction of Judea. Their numbers were quite small. There's only about 30 names that comprise the first generation identified in rabbinic literature. They were men of piety. Facing a world without temple or Jewish political autonomy, they turned to scripture and undertook a radical project, adapting divine law to a transformed imperial context. Their interpretive work expanded Torah from its original meaning of the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses, to encompass then the entire Hebrew Bible, and then all of rabbinic commentary itself became Torah. And so the rabbis positioned themselves as guardians of Israel, claiming the divine authority to preserve and redefine Torah for a new era. But the Jewish cultural landscape was profoundly different. There was no temple pilgrimage if there was no temple complex. Sacrifices that ensured collective atonement lacked holy ground, and priests who had long served as stewards of the people lost their institutional place. The Mishnah, the earliest collection of rabbinic teaching, really resiliently acts as if nothing's changed. Everything's fine, guys. And it piously imagines the temple still existing with its pilgrimage and tithes, and yet at times the harsh reality intrudes. So for example, in Tractate Maaser Shani, which concerns the second tithe of the harvest that was supposed to be eaten in God's presence in the temple, the tractate goes on with chapter after chapter of laws, imagining people are still doing this. But at one point, the text concedes that without a temple, the sacred produce must be left to rot. The stench of rotting tithe must have hung heavy in their minds as they admitted to themselves that this was their new reality. Sacred obligations now collided with impossible circumstances. And so the earliest rabbis assumed the role of Torah experts at the very moment when everything it meant to be Jewish was upended. And the Jews didn't have to listen. In fact, evidence suggests that for some time, few Jews were compelled to follow rabbinic guidance. There are texts that express repeated discontent with persons called Amei Haaretz, or ordinary Jews who didn't want to listen to rabbis. In one Mishnaic source, rabbis are advised to avoid the assemblies of such ignorant men. Other sources indicate friction between rabbis and non-rabbinic Jews, with accounts of some sages being robbed, mistreated, or ridiculed. Now, also, synagogues already existed, and they served a number of functions for the community, including charity collection, communal prayer, public Torah reading, group study run by wealthy members of the communities, not rabbis. New sources of expertise had also emerged as Roman imperial expansion established new forms of local administration, imposing new laws. They really zhuzhed up the cities with amphitheaters, temples, markets, and they shaped the very roads that mark the countryside. This period also saw the circulation of freelance ritual specialists who trafficked in promises and charisma. Some hawked amulets, as you see here, and incantations. Others were miracle workers. And so the rabbis were just one of many expert options available to ancient Jews. And to be honest, a lot of people didn't find them that compelling. So amidst this setting, yeah, sorry, not to offend them, they're dead, but it's fine. They did well for themselves. Okay, that's why we're here, right? That's good. I love the, okay. Amidst this setting, early rabbis began to mingle with each other, often over dinner, because where else are you getting together in antiquity? And where they discussed matters of Torah late into the night. We have numerous sources that begin naming a string of rabbis and describing a particular debate that they had while reclining at dinner. These dinners played an important role in creating rabbinic identity. Those who regularly dined together were socialized into rabbinic Jewishness and acquired a sense of how other rabbis perceived the world. Their dining practices distinguished their group from outsiders who did not know or did not participate in rabbinic norms. And from these dining spaces, rabbinic rulings emerged that became rabbinic law. For example, Tosefta Brachot records one such dinner where servants served perhaps a forgotten platter of dates at the end of a meal shared by rabbis. And so I'll read this source. It happened that Rabban Gamliel and the elders were reclining in Jericho, and servants placed in front of them dates, and they ate them. Rabbi Akiva jumped up, said one blessing abridged from 3, and Rabban Gamliel said to him, "Akiva, what is with you? You're sticking your head into the argument." And he said back to him, "Rabbi, you've taught, as it says in Exodus, to lean after the majority, so you like it this other way, but like everyone else agrees with me." So let me explain some of this context here. They've presumably already finished their meal with the full Birkat HaMazon, or the 3 blessings the rabbis had crafted for the end of a Jewish meal. But now we have this platter of dates. So Akiva quickly recites an abbreviated blessing, even though Rabban Gamliel was known to insist that in these scenarios, you gotta do it again in full. And Akiva essentially says, it's just a few dates. It's like a snack. And insists, really, everyone else likes to do it this way. The dinner party ends on maybe a grumpy note, but we can see how the rabbinic table shaped rabbinic consensus. And there's good reason that dinner was a prime space for the production of rabbinic identity. When people eat together, they're just not eating. They're strengthening their social bonds, or fracturing them if it's Thanksgiving. I didn't write that. That just was on my mind. As conversation cements shared ideology. In the ancient Roman world, hospitality and banquet culture were crucial social institutions for this reason. Wealthy Romans were expected to share their wealth by feeding and entertaining friends and clients daily. I'm an introvert. That sounds terrible. But this friendship was forged over food and created a social circle with common values, supported through the continual exchange of gifts and favors. And we know the rabbis were aware of the Roman dinner party, or convivium. Not only do their stories describe them reclining in the Roman style, but rabbinic literature makes repeated reference to a traclin, which refers to the Latin triclinium, which is a dining room with 3 couches arranged around a central table in a U pattern, as depicted here from Pompeii. Archaeological evidence attests that at least some Galilean and Syrian houses adopted these Roman architectural features. So here you'll see that magnificent house of Dionysus in Sepphoris that has a 15-paneled mosaic floor shaped in the U pattern, depicting scenes of the god of feasting. And so we can see where the couches would be arranged because the floor is preserved for us. In the lower part of the city, the house of Orpheus contains 2 triclinia, and you can see here this really beautiful scene of the triclinium table. And with such investments of time and resources into the construction of these dining spaces, archaeologist Catherine Dunbabham insists there can be little doubt that the owners of these houses see this as their most important social activity. And ancient Jews are living here. They're participating in Roman convivium and all of its social benefits. But the rabbis see an opportunity. They harness the setting to infuse Jewish piety into the space. They imagined convivium-styled banquets for the celebration of Jewish festivals and Shabbat. Most famously, the Mishnah incorporates the convivium into the Passover Seder, requiring even the poorest of participants to recline and drink mixed wine during dinner in order to symbolize the Israelite freedom from slavery. The rabbis crafted extensive laws about dinner. I don't know if you've read the Talmud recently, but so much is actually about dinner, which I appreciate. Foods and their preparation, instructions for reclining, washing, and drinking that still inform Jewish dining habits today. They also instituted blessings throughout the meal. This in itself was not unusual for the convivium setting. Romans had a sense of divine responsibility for their guests, and they often invoked Dei Hospitalis, or hospitality gods, or even Jupiter Hospitalis, to honor them at the feast. But the creation of Jewish table liturgies served to sacralize Jewish domestic space. So as Laura Lieber describes, the domestic table became a humble but no less holy altar. The table as altar was portable and ubiquitous in a way that the Jerusalem temple was not. But it still required liturgical expertise to unlock its full potential. Those who knew the proper rabbinic benedictions were therefore afforded table honors, which the Palestinian Talmud adds by expanding upon this Tosefta and says, those who are reclining are forbidden to eat anything until he who blessed tastes first. So you're special if you know the blessings. This text promises that those who learn the rabbinic benedictions will be treated as the highest ranking person at the table. So these banquets are not resisting the social expectation of rank and honor that are prevalent in the Roman world, but they're capitalizing on them in order to elevate Torah as the highest honored status. Rabbis understood that the convivium represented more than just a meal. It was a space where ideas were exchanged, relationships were strengthened, and cultural values were transmitted. Unable to exercise power in the political sphere, the rabbis instead concentrated their creative energies on the domestic and communal spaces that remained within Jewish control. By elevating the dinner table as a site of religious meaning and transforming the very act of eating into an opportunity for spiritual reflection and communal bonding, they demonstrated that Jewish identity and practice could flourish in the absence of political sovereignty. The ritualized meal became a form of Jewish resilience, a way of asserting Jewish distinctiveness and maintaining communal cohesion without directly challenging Rome, because we were done with that. This dynamic is illustrated. I can't help myself. I'm a college professor. If you don't make jokes, the students sleep, okay? This is my life. So I have a great source that illustrates this, and it's a story where a Jewish host goes to extraordinary lengths to honor Torah when the sages come to dinner. So once, Rabbi Chia bar Abba was invited to a banquet hosted by a man in Laodicea. They brought before him a huge table that was loaded with every kind of produce that was created during the 6 days of creation. And in the center of the table, because that's not weird, a child was sitting, reciting, "The earth is the Lord's, and all that is in it, the world and those who dwell in it," from Psalm 24:1. Why? So that the owner would not grow conceited. So we have a host who's super wealthy because he has this table with all the foods of creation. And one can imagine a table of roasted meats soaking in their juices, figs and olives adorning platters, foreign spices cloying the air. These lavish culinary offerings would typically serve to impress the guests and reinforce the host's social status. And yet in the center of it all, a small child sits reminding everyone that such bounty belongs to God. Now, the host is not a rabbinic Jew. He's just an ordinary Jew being a little weird. And the rabbis leave, and they do not tell people to do this, right? It is idiosyncratic. But they do preserve the story in a midrashic chapter devoted to the ways Jews could merit rewards. We learned that the host used to be a butcher who would set aside a fine animal for Shabbat, for the Shabbat dinner each week. For such observance, caring so much about Shabbat dinner, he was rewarded with all of his wealth. The rabbinic guests are still participating in a banquet that feels very Roman, but it's also infused with the values of Torah. And the rabbis sought to convince other Jews to elevate Torah in their dining setting by providing a model of a superior table. In their minds, the rabbinic table served as a spiritual anchor for the Jewish community. So we have a different story in the same chapter. It's a whole chapter about dinner parties. I got very excited when I read it. And they're depicted as so appealing that even the Roman emperor desires their table. So our rabbi made a feast for Antonius on Shabbat. They brought before him prepared foods that were cold. He ate from them and found them very yummy. Rabbi made a feast for him on a weekday and brought before him steaming hot foods. And Antonius said to Rabbi, those cold foods on Shabbat were way better than these. And Rabbi explained that the warm weekday food was missing a single spice. Antonius said to him, is there anything in the king's treasury that's lacking? Like, I'm the emperor, like, I can do something. And Rabbi said that food was missing Shabbat. Do you have Shabbat? These dialogues between Antonius and a rabbinic patriarch appear fairly routinely. They're traditionally understood to refer to Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, an early Jewish patriarch, and a Roman emperor, though we're not entirely sure which one. In this story, Rabbi Yehuda hosts Antonius for 2 feasts, an ordinary meal prepared through conventional cooking methods, and a Shabbat meal served cold due to the rabbinic prohibition against lighting a fire to cook on Shabbat. Antonius is astounded at the delectable taste of the cold Shabbat foods in comparison to everyday food and seeks to find out their secret. But the secret is Shabbat, and only the rabbis are the ones who can possess this spice. Now, that a Roman, even more so like the highest ranking Roman, would be impressed by the rabbinic table, how much more so should other Jews? There's a reason they're telling this story. The rabbis want to persuade other Jews that their way of dining was superior to any Roman convivium. And so to do so, they made promises that partaking of a rabbinic meal would provide ordinary Jews direct access to God. Mishnah Avot goes so far as to equate the words spoken by rabbis dining together with the sacrifices of the former Jerusalem temple. If 3 have eaten at one table and have spoken over it words of Torah, it is as if they have eaten from the table of God, as it is written in Ezekiel, and he told me, this is the table that stands before the Lord. The table depicted here portrays at least 3 rabbis sharing a meal and discussing Torah. The central table is likened to the altar by the invoked proof text from Ezekiel, where a divine messenger relays to Ezekiel all the dimensions of this visionary temple. This passage in Avot belongs to an exhortatory chapter praising the expertise of rabbinic sages. Later in the same chapter, the text insists that the divine presence dwells with those occupied in rabbinic Torah study. Rabbi Halafta of Kfar Hanania said, when 10 sit together and occupy themselves with Torah, the Shekhinah abides among them, as it is said, God stands in the congregation of God. So thus far we've seen how rabbis transformed the Roman convivium into spaces for Jewish piety. They ritualized dinner and in so doing made a statement about Jewish resilience. The house of God may be destroyed, but now Jews could access divine presence directly in their domestic spaces if only they would follow rabbinic guidelines. So now I want to turn to the strategies rabbis employed to encourage other Jews to open up their homes to them, feeding them dinner, providing spaces to gather, and then eventually monetary support. So in Mishnah Avot chapter 1, householders are urged to let your house be a meeting house for sages. There were strategic reasons for rabbis to desire hospitality. Guest friendship, or in Latin hospititium, was a formal relationship in antiquity, forged through extending hospitality to each other. These friendships were initiated through an official invitation to the guests that offered to invite him into house and home, inventare eum tecto ac domo. And the relationship was often recorded on tokens called tessera hospitalis, and I have a few just depicted here. The relationship could be hereditary across generations, which is why you need proof of it in these physical forms. And so invitations of hospitality would create a network that could be called upon to offer services such as business contacts, donations, gifts, protection, favors, recommendation for positions, you name it. So those who invited rabbis into their homes became attached to the rabbis through this formal friendship that could offer the rabbis future benefits. One invitation could become future invitations to make use of their new friend's estate or property, to attend banquets where more contacts with important people could be made. On one occasion, we learned that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Ishmael, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Eliezer HaKapara spent Shabbat in the shop of Patzi in Lida. That's in the Tosefta. We just have this little line. But if you jump over to the Talmud, suddenly you learn that the sons of Patzi became related to Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi through marriage. And then it further names a later descendant, Rabbi Yehuda ben Patzi, who becomes a rabbinic scholar. And so by tracing these connections, you can see how an invitation of hospitality translated to marriage between families and at least one son pursuing rabbinic apprenticeship, and probably more. But of even more significance to this passage, the invitation of the rabbi into a householder's home recognized the expertise of the Torah scholar. The passage continues by exhorting the host to powder yourself in the dust of their feet and thirstily drink of their words. This metaphor of powdering oneself refers to sitting on the ground at someone's feet, a space ordinarily reserved for social inferiors. This text encourages the householder to take up such a posture in order not to drink of wine, but of the words flowing from the mouths of Torah experts. The portrait of the guest-host relationship in this Mishnah upends many standard social conventions of this period. This kind of gathering does not elevate the status and wealth of the host, but rather uplifts the expertise of the Torah scholar as the focal point of the gathering. The text does not outright reject the debt of reciprocity inherent to hospitality, but reframes it. The rabbinic guest is not obligated to the host for the invitation. Rather, the host is obligated to the rabbi for gifting an opportunity to hear the precious words of Torah. So in this scenario, Jews are encouraged to extend hospitality toward rabbis, and in return, they receive special spiritual access as their payment. Why is this inversion of power important to the rabbis? Hospitality, especially in the ancient world, was akin to patronage, and participants understood that they owed each other for hospitality that must be returned in kind. In one text, Rabbi Yochanan, again very grumpily, describes hospitality as a negative social force that lingers. He quotes from a proverb that says, "Evil will not depart from the house of one who returns evil for good." And Rabbi Yochanan explains this proverb saying, if your neighbor entertained you with lentils and you entertained him with meat, which is obviously better, you're still in debt to him. Why? Because he showed hospitality to you first. You're screwed forever. But the power of this kind of patronage is hovering over the rabbis. So while it was beneficial for rabbis to solicit wealthy connections who could help support Torah study, they ran the risk of owing their hosts for their generosity. Don't worry, I've got a great example of this. There was a friendship between Rabbi Gamliel, an early Jewish patriarch, and Beitos ben Zenon of Lydda. Beitos ben Zenon was a wealthy merchant who owned property in Lydda, the center of wealthy Jewish life following the destruction of the temple. Their two families seem to have had close ties. According to one Tosefta passage, Rabbi Gamliel and the sages were reclining in the house of Beitos, and they were studying the laws of Passover the entire night until the rooster crowed, a captive audience. This is a Passover convivium, and likely was not the first or last gathering of sages at Beitos' table. Yet this relationship imposed its own reciprocal expectations. Elsewhere in the Jerusalem Talmud, we learn, Betos ben Zenon asked Rabban Gamliel and the sages at Yavna, may one make sarakin, a kind of twisted flatbread, with figures on Passover? They told him no, because a woman's going to spend so much time with it, making it pretty, and it'll become leavened. And they told him, one would say these are forbidden, but yours are cool. Here, Betos ben Zenon raises the issue of using sarakin as a suitable dough for the Passover commandment of eating unleavened bread, which maybe he brings up because other Jews were complaining. How come he gets to have the pretty flatbread? And so he petitions to use his special fancy style, but it runs the risk that extra time would leaven the dough and then it would be invalid for the mitzvah. But the rabbis conclude that they'll make an exception for him. It's a little convenient that their friend and host for very fancy dinner parties gets an exception in halakha. And this anecdote provides a glimpse at the potential challenges of entering into hospitality friendships. The rabbis rule in Betos' favor and demonstrates the pressure to modify rabbinic law toward the desires of their dinner companions. And it happens again. In another passage, Betos ben Zenon asks a different question concerning one of his shipments of figs. Remember, he's a wealthy merchant. And a barrel of libation wine had cracked and fallen upon it. And so he wonders, can I still sell these to Jews? I mean, it's idolatrous now, but it's still fine, right? I don't want to lose my money. And the rabbis rule that since the wine imparted no beneficial flavor, he could still sell them. I think this ruling is perhaps a bit suspect. We know that soaking dates in figs and wine plumps them up. We have ancient Roman cookbooks with recipes to douse your dates with wine. And the passage goes on to liken the scenario of wine-soaked figs to vinegar spilled upon beans, which are delicious. Now, I know vinegar in antiquity is different, but just stay with me. I think the rabbis are, again, being cozy with their friend. I think they were compelled to find a reasonable solution to salvage their friend's damaged goods because of the social expectations of their friendship. Their dining habit produced a larger relationship of complicated favors. While rabbis stood to benefit from forging friendships with wealthy Jews who invited them to dinner, they risked social pressures. So, just as rabbinic literature reframed the convivium table to emphasize Torah instead of wealth, they also reframed hospitality given to rabbis as a kind of divine investment that would bring spiritual rewards. We've already seen in Mishnah Avot a promise that householders would get to thirstily drink of the words spoken by their rabbi guests. In other sources, though, the rewards are more explicit. In the Sifra Deuteronomy, the rewards for hosting Torah scholars is expressed through analogy. It's a little confusing, I'll explain. So let me read it and then we'll go through it. There's this analogy. A certain fellow received sages and their disciples, and everyone sang his praises. The non-Jews came, and he also received them. And then bandits came, and he received them. People began to say, it must be so-and-so's way to receive just anyone. But thus did Moses say to Israel, that's enough gold, dia zahav, for the tabernacle. So that's enough gold for the calf. So let me tell you what this means. So we've got a guy who's hosting Torah scholars, which is great, but then he's also hosting non-Jews and bandits, the horror. And his neighbors, well, gossiping, right? Why is he so willing to entertain unsavory characters? The Midrashic commentators take a phrase from Deuteronomy, di zahav, abounding with gold, and they reread it as dia zahav, enough gold. The gold collected for the tabernacle provides absolution for the sin of the golden calf. Thus, the householder hosting Torah scholars merits absolution for hosting not nice people. So he gets some kind of absolution because he has the rabbis over. It's great. In Tractate Sota, we learn that such rewards can even extend into the afterlife. Rabbi Chia taught, in the future, the Holy One, blessed be He, will make shade for those who give in the shadow of those who study Torah. This powerful metaphor suggests that patrons who enable Torah study through material support will share eschatological rewards, finding shelter alongside the scholars they supported in the world to come. This legitimizes the economic reliance of rabbinic scholars upon community members, assuring their donors they're going to be rewarded. Another tactic rabbis used to reframe hospitality was to compare it to charity. Leviticus Rabbah invokes a biblical proof text, and bring the homeless poor into your home from Isaiah 58:7, and proposes new identities for this homeless poor. So they're like, oh, who is it? It could be the chronically poor, the formerly wealthy poor, mourners, and Torah scholars. Each association is based on a wordplay in the Hebrew. And what's striking is that the first three identities make sense. Whether one is poor from birth or loses their wealth, they're reasonably understood as poor. And caring for the dead, being a mourner, is also classified as an act of charity under the category of Gemalut Chasidim, because it cannot be reciprocated. But then the passage, transitions to the Torah scholars, and this is what it says. Bring the homeless Meradim poor into your home. These are the Torah scholars who enter the homes of the common folk, the Amei Haaretz again, and quench their thirst with words of Torah. Therefore it states, bring the homeless poor to your home. And bring the homeless poor into your home. These are the Torah scholars and their students who teach Israel the difference between impurity and purity, and the difference between what is forbidden and permitted, and teach them to do the will of their Father in heaven. Therefore, it states, and bring the homeless poor to your home. In these two cases, this is all based on a kind of linguistic play. So the first paragraph is invoking the word, so we have the word merodim for homeless poor. It's invoking the near homophone merabin, or quenches. And then the second paragraph associates merodim with morin, or teaches. So it's just a little fancy wordplay. But it has big consequences. Torah scholars are considered like the poor, not because they lack material wealth, but because they possess knowledge that others need. Their teaching is presented as essential, like water to the thirsty, which justifies them receiving hospitality and an audience. By reframing this exchange as charity, rabbis reshape the typical social expectation of reciprocity. Just as the poor cannot repay their debt, the rabbis are not expected to either. The scholar has already fulfilled their obligation by sharing Torah, which is portrayed as supremely valuable. This removes any sense of social debt. The rabbi has given their gift. Divine reward will follow. Now, this is a tactic of persuasion, whether you merit rewards through personal edification or absolution for other wrongs. And those who host Torah scholars are supposed to be making the worthiest choice that will benefit them in a spiritual plane. While this might have been and was persuasive to some Jews, modern readers, us, might pause to scrutinize its ethical implications. Were they just using dinner parties and hospitality as like a manipulative power grab? I know it sometimes feels like that, okay? But I actually don't think so. I mean, power is always present. It doesn't go away. But the rabbis were not inventing a novel system of patronage from whole cloth. They inherited and adapted a well-established biblical tradition that had long prized the support of Torah expertise and religious leadership. The Levites received no territorial inheritance in ancient Israel, but they were supported by tithes and offerings of the community in exchange for their religious service. What the rabbis did was recalibrate this tradition for a post-temple world, where Torah study and teaching had become central expressions of religious devotion. Their strategy was to champion a particular vision of Torah supremacy that did naturally elevate their own professional skills as interpreters, teachers, and judges. This rhetorical move was both pragmatic and ideological. I think the rabbis genuinely believed in the transformative power of Torah and saw themselves as essential mediators of a sacred tradition. Whether one views this as ethical or problematic probably depends on whether one accepts the underlying premise that Torah expertise constitutes a form of spiritual wealth valuable enough to warrant material support. If we take seriously the notion that many Jews in antiquity found value in their ancestral traditions, thought of God as a real agent in the world, and felt inclined toward pious practices to whatever degree, it should not surprise us that many Jews valued this personal spiritual access that rabbis offered. And I have one final passage that I think really illustrates this nicely. In the Jerusalem Talmud, Tractate Brachot, we learn about a householder who let rabbis gather under his fig trees. Rabbi Hia bar Abba and a group of his students were waiting to study Torah under a fig tree. The owner of the fig tree always came every morning at sunrise and collected figs. And they, the rabbis, said, maybe he doesn't trust us. Like, why is he here? And so let's change where we sit. But then the next day, the owner of the fig tree came to them, and he said to them, the one mitzvah you used to offer me, you're withholding from me. And they said, oh, we just thought you didn't trust us. He's like, I'm coming in the morning because the figs get wormy if the sun hits them too much. I find this a really beautiful story because I too can get very cynical as an ancient historian. But the rabbis were operating from a position of relative social insecurity, and they misinterpret this householder's daily fig collection. They also are like, oh, do you actually want us? But in reality, the householder who cannot study Torah, who's busy doing and managing his estate, is deprived the one opportunity that he sees as a spiritual opportunity to participate in the merit of Torah because he can provide a space for it. And the setting of the fig grove is equally revealing. During this formative period, the absence of formal academies meant that rabbinic learning was inherently dependent on the goodwill of property owners. Unlike later periods when you'll have yeshivot as established institutions, early rabbis are sitting under fig trees. They're relying on a network of hospitality, gathering in gardens, courtyards, private estates. This dependency created a symbiotic relationship. Rabbis received physical space for their intellectual activities, and householders gained spiritual capital through their association with Torah study. And this passage inverts the power dynamics by positioning the householder as spiritually motivated. The rabbis emerge as somewhat oblivious, but they're then confronted with the exact kind of piety they're aiming to cultivate. So the theme of this series is, I'm not thank you yet. You have to hear my conclusion. Okay. The theme of this series is Jewish creative resilience. And the rabbis represent a critical moment in Jewish history. In the wake of catastrophe, the destruction of the temple, the loss of political sovereignty, the collapse of traditional religious structures, they demonstrate a profound form of creative resilience. They could not rebuild the temple. They could not restore Jewish autonomy, but they could transform the dinner table into an altar, the home into a sacred space, and contact with Torah scholars into opportunities for divine encounter. So by infusing Roman hospitality with Jewish ritual, rabbis asserted that Jewish life could flourish without imperial permission or institutional power. The dinner table became a kind of laboratory for reimagining Judaism, a space where they crafted new liturgies, debated legal interpretations, forged social networks, cultivated donors who could let that work continue. And these settings provided rabbis the perfect space to impress others with their facility in Torah and to cultivate the same kind of pious devotion that we see from the fig owner. They made Torah, and by extension their expertise, the star of the Jewish table. This did not come without downsides. One might assume experts hold all the power because they know things, but that's not true as a professor. It's just not true. The expert needs donors, clients, employers, peers, lots of other people that they exchange a little bit of their autonomy for social and material recognition. And despite very well documented aversion to patronage, rabbis solicited hospitality, and they developed rationales to balance the tension and acknowledge the social value of their intellectual worth. They negotiated these tensions by reframing their tables using the language of Jewish piety. They used the logic of redemptive almsgiving, divine investment that was already pervasive in the period to offer spiritual rewards to other Jews. And it was probably aspirational. And we know Rabban Gamliel, his relationship with Beitos ben Zonan demonstrates just how much they were still in compromised positions. But it also offered a promise to those who cared about Torah. If you would support rabbinic Torah scholars, you would gain access to God. It would be trite to say this was merely a tactic to gain rabbinic authority. People cared about Torah. Rabbis cared about Torah. The rabbis just thought to say, if you care about Torah, it makes sense to invite a rabbi over for dinner. Thank you. Now you can see it. Thank
you very much. I promised Dr. Dalton that you guys were a crew that knew how to ask really good questions.
Bad questions are good too. All questions are welcome.
Who wants to go first?
I just curious, I'm not sure exactly what the timeline of this and the destruction of the temple, but where did the Kohanim fit into this? And was there any tension between the Kohanim and?
Yeah. I can repeat the question. So the question is, where are the priests and what do they feel? It's two answers to that question. One, it is actually a great mystery that we don't know. After the destruction of the temple, the priests kind of stop operating in a visible way that can be recorded or survives to us in the material and textual record. So there's this huge gap from the destruction of the temple in 70 CE up to the second in Judea Jewish revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt, where it ends around 135 CE. There's a huge gap of things we don't know. What we do know is that after that, not just the priests, Pharisees, all the kind of sectarian Judaism stops operating in a visible way. What we do know is that of the early rabbis, of those 30, about a third are associated as being part of priestly families. So it's not so much that, and this is a really important point, and when I have a chapter about tithes, because rabbis also do funny things with tithes, which you would think means they don't like priests, except many of them are from priestly families. And I think that's a point we forget, because we often assume the rabbis are in competition with the priests, and I actually think piety dispels some of that, because if they are so pious, if the Mishnah just imagines the temple is still going, they can't just hate priests. They might think that season has ended, and they might have things to say about the high priest, and they don't always say the nicest things about priests, but it would be silly to think that they thought they were in competition. The fact of the matter is there was no temple. And what is clear from rabbinic literature, at least for the rabbis, there is no aspiration to really see it rebuilt. They don't see that it's going to happen. They have accepted the reality of Roman defeat so thoroughly that even messianic expectations for some kind of deliverer peter out in rabbinic literature. We have other texts that keep that apocalyptic fervor. And the rabbis are like, last time we did that, we died. Let's not do that again. And so they do not actively resist Rome. They kind of do it quietly. Yeah, but it's a great question.
So a seudat, is that the same thing, only in a different language from the word that was a triclinian?
So when the traclin, which is the rabbinicized version of Latin, refers to the dining room itself. So not the meal itself, but the actual structure of the space. And so, I mean, we call ours dining room, but the actual structure of reclining on those couches is so important that the Latin word actually makes its way into the rabbinic literature, which is pretty interesting. It's just because everyone had them. Yeah.
Over here.
So there weren't priests when there was the temple. So when did it become a thing?
Yeah, great question. When did rabbis become a thing? Two things to say. One, we don't actually know, but there are some dates we can give you. So the temple's destroyed in 70 CE. Around 200 CE, we think the Mishnah is codified, put together, put in its form, in a form that then later rabbis are commenting upon, which gets us the Talmud. So somewhere between 70 and 200, we have a gathering of rabbis. Some were members of priestly families. Some might have been attached to Pharisees. There's a lot of mysteries about where these people come from. But the one thing we know is that they are not setting up a group in Galilee called the Kohanim or the Pharisees. And part of that is because the conditions of the time have changed, and also because something new is happening. They are actually doing something new, and we can really put our finger to it in 200 CE with the Mishnah. But over time, these men who many of them probably had fled from Judea, had been part of the temple establishment in Jerusalem, are doing something new. They don't have the temple anymore. They're not part of Jerusalem anymore. They're in Galilee. And they're meeting together and they're having dinner. And over time, it becomes something. Yeah. Yeah. So they initially call themselves sages or wise men. And eventually they are given in the Mishnah the title rabbi. And it marks them as teachers. So it means that they were a teacher who took disciples, who took students. And so you have, again, only like 30 in the first generation of men who, let's be clear, are not, they're all pretty wealthy. They come from high-ranking families, presumably based on the description of their estates and some of them have students who are like working in the fields for them. So they're doing all right, but they're taking on students. And so these contacts with wealthy people that they're forming over dinner are giving them eventually students. They're funneling in, because who has the time to study all day but rich people, right? So, but I mean, genuinely, they're men who have the time and the means to do this. And so these contacts give them more students, and over time, the sense of we're training rabbis emerges. But at any one generation, once we get into later period, there's only like 100 to 200 rabbis at a time. So we're still talking about a very, very small group, and they're not in charge of synagogues. Like, they're not doing the things we associate with rabbis today. That is a very slow process for rabbis to be involved in synagogues.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so my question is a related question. How does that process happen? Obviously, we have an idea of who rabbis are now, and we all listen to them very thoroughly. What causes this transition from a very small movement that few people seem to actually listen to the sort of driving force of normative Judaism?
Yeah. You know, one of the things my book does is try to answer this question, because we often assume it's because the rabbis know things. But again, just because you know things, if there aren't people who care about what you know, it doesn't matter. I actually just finished an essay for a festschrift. It's a thing you honor someone at the end of their career, and they asked me to like tie modernity in, and so I have a bit about the rabbis and a bit about Fauci, and but genuinely, like how that coronavirus raised for us this really interesting question of when do you listen to experts? Who constitutes expertise? Who's persuasive? You don't have to listen to them just because they have titles, just because they're people, and people don't. And so one of the things my book does is try to set aside knowledge The idea that people just saw a really smart rabbi and fell at their feet is surely not what happened. The rabbis made promises without a temple, in very few kind of Jewish cultic spaces. The rabbis are offering something, and it seems to appeal to some people. And there's like a cynicalness where we always think the rabbis are out, at least in my field, everyone's like, the rabbis just want power. I'm like, power is there, but they also might have cared. And I think some other people cared. And I think we have to think about it in terms of socialization, of slow processes of time. I tell a story in my book that I really like from the Talmud. And there's a rabbi, and he's teaching about shotnets. Sorry, I'm losing my voice at the end of the night. So mixed fabric. And there's a guy in the crowd who goes, "Hey, rabbi, this guy's breaking what you're saying." And he's expecting the rabbi to kind of like throw him out of this study circle. And the rabbi stands up and he's like, "Shame on you. Shame on you." And it's just in the Talmud. It's a small story, but I like to think about these stories and be like, what would it have felt like to be there? And I have this guy who's trying to be like, oh, I know what the rabbi's going to say. And then how everyone must have gossiped all week and be like, don't you see how Yoni was so embarrassed in front of the rabbi? And maybe someone was like, oh, that rabbi's a good guy. Let's invite him over for dinner. And then the rabbi does this really weird blessing, and you're like, that's kind of cool. And then you do it at home. And like, I think that like slow steps of socialization is how Rabbinic Judaism won. And it didn't win completely. There were plenty of people, the Karaite Jews, for example, who famously were like, no, you're not for me. Just like today. Not everyone's like, the rabbis aren't for me. But I think enough people in antiquity cared, which is why we should actually like take seriously the things rabbis are promising people, because it might show us why they listened in the first place.
You kind of, dropped the timeline of 70 to 200, but there are some models that are pre that time period that seem to feed into this, sort of like the teacher of righteousness in Quran, who are not connected to the temples. He's a knowledgeable guy of Torah. He's also maybe a charismatic, gets a bunch of people around him. Also, there's a lot of stories in the New Testament where Jesus is eating in people's houses, teaching Torah, and they're actually financially supporting him. And I'm saying, ooh, this seems really close to
So the statement is, this is really powerful. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can see very similar dynamics. We can see this in the New Testament with Jesus, absolutely. And in fact, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we even see a kind of precursor to table benedictions. It's not the same as what the rabbis institute. So the rabbis are not making this up out of nothing. And I think that also gets to the prior question, which is that they're working with what we got. They're refining it, they're crafting it, but they're certainly not inventing things like tzedakah. Synagogues were already collecting charity. The rabbis might have codified a particular way they wanted things to work, but they're tapping into things people are already caring about in their communities. And so one of the things I talk about early in my book is that while the temple destruction is catastrophic and something we actually should not diminish, some people have started to in my field, I think it's actually quite profound. Just to think about the number of lives that were lost. But the rabbis didn't invent holiness. Why they go to Galilee, why they begin to gather with each other is because they were already participating in holiness projects in Jerusalem, which all of these sects are participating in robust debates. The debates actually show the strength of piety. And Jerusalem, right before the temple's destruction, is at its height. We have evidence Jews from the diaspora are sending tithes to the temple. Herod has built additions onto the temple in addition to a palace. So all these building projects have happened, and it's because everyone cares. And so it's not like the rabbis invent this caring of Torah. That's, I think, what propelled them to have dinner with each other in the first place.
What drove you to this topic and drove your interest in this field?
Money. No, not for me. Not here's what happened, okay? So I was a graduate student, and I'd always been interested in charity, and I thought I was going to write a dissertation about charity, and I wrote a proposal that got approved about charity, and so I thought, okay, before I start writing, I should read. So I read the Jerusalem Talmud in translation in just a couple weeks. Like, I just wanted to read, like, skim it. So I could, when I say the Talmud has this thing, I actually knew, right? Like, I feel like it's a huge corpus, but I'm like, I have to have read the thing front to back. And I just sat in my carrel and I read. And I'm like, I'm going to mark everything related to charity as I read. And this is like a great way to start a research. It is, graduate students in the room, a great way to start your dissertation project. And then I kept finding other passages about dinner. And my first article ever was a passage about a woman donor, a tithe donor, who everyone had read the story as this. It's a story about Rabbi Eliezer and this woman, wealthy woman, who comes and asks him a question about Torah. And he says, I'd rather burn the words of Torah than give them to a woman. And everyone reads that story about gender, which, it's happening. But they forget that in the story, his son gets really angry because she takes her tithe away. She was bankrolling them. And his son is like, oh, you fool! Just teach the woman. And Rabbi Eliezer is like, I'm not going to do it. But at its core was this money, this support. And so I do have a chapter about charity and how charity to rabbis becomes a thing. But then I'm like, it's part of a larger story. It's part of a story of rabbis not in the study house, having to talk to other people who don't necessarily care what they have to say to get material support that they actually need. I mean, it costs a lot to be a scholar now and in antiquity. Donate to this fund. No, I'm helping you out. So that's what I'd say.
Okay, we got two more. How did the rabbis influence the set order of, like, Friday night service, Kiddush, prayers, etc., later on after Shabbat, Havdalah?
Not to the medieval period, like late medieval period, is what we would, even the simple things like Lecha Dodi is a medieval poem. Right? The rabbis aren't singing it. Didn't exist yet. Like, the rabbis of antiquity are not singing it. Even things like Kaddish for the dead is medieval. We have the beginnings of these formal liturgies, certainly, different formal liturgies in the Talmud. They spend a lot of time talking about the Shema, different davening, but they don't actually have the services that we think of today. They're actually quite late. Oh, yeah. Like the order of the table, that's there. We have that in the rabbinic liturgies for the Shabbat table we have in the Talmud, and even some in a little bit, beginning in the Mishnah. Even down to who reclines first and when. This is the thing that the rabbis actually really give us, is dinner. The service part, which is what I thought you were asking about, that comes much later. And it's not initially... Yep, all of that comes from the rabbis in Tractate Brachot, of all the blessings. There's modifications, right? Like, it's not like it's static through time, but that we get from the rabbis of late antiquity. They spend a lot of time about dinner.
We will let my father, a teacher, ask the last question.
No pressure.
This is not so much a question, but maybe a comment, and it's kind of fuzzy because I haven't really looked at it. Maybe you wrote about it, or others have, but you said something at the end that is very suggestive. You talked about making the table an altar. And I don't know if anybody ate on a shulchan in the Bible, but I do know that is, after all, a place where offerings and gifts are given to the gods. And I don't remember the source in Ugaritic where I saw it. But if nobody did that, if nobody ate on a shulchan, no humans I mean, then for the rabbis to use the word shulchan and not a Greek or Latin word is very audacious.
It is. And they actually cite a biblical proof text about the temple to say, that's what it's like when you eat dinner with us. It is audacious. Absolutely. But that's part of, the theme of this series is Jewish creative resilience. And I think that, there's a lot of chutzpah there in a really good way, right? Which is like, we don't have this space. But if we talk about Torah, it's as if we are there. And so I think that's what they're actually, trying to say.
Okay, on that note, thank you very much. If you would like to hear more of Dr. Dalton's scholarship, you are invited to join us on campus tomorrow at noon to hear her talk, Rabbis Getting Rich, because it's about money, the ethics and economy of Torah. And you may find the details about the lecture on the Center for Jewish Studies.
It's more of a lecture. This was formal. Tomorrow's informal. Tomorrow we're friends. So it's
If you would like to learn informally with Dr. Dalton,
thank you.
come for lunch at noon and we'll schmooze about
exactly.
the rabbis.
We'll forge friendships.
Yes. Our next community lecture will be here at the Capp Center on Tuesday, December 9th. Come here, noted scholar Eve Krakowski.
She's great. You should come. She's really good.
Speaking, you probably thought the ketubah was always Jewish. She is speaking on how the ketubah became Jewish. Please remember to register.
She's
in
good, I
advance,
told you.
And we look forward to seeing you. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Dr. Dalton.